video was all about my work as a family history researcher, and it's not easy to sum up exactly what I do because there are so many different historical resources out there and I can use any of them at any time. One of my favourite resources, although they're not always the easiest to look at, is newspaper archives. Old newspapers have the potential to reveal so much more about the world that our ancestors lived in and the things they got up to than your standard censuses, birth certificates, baptism, marriage and burial records. And according to a very comprehensive list compiled by Brian Pears on the wonderful Januki website, 175 years ago, in 1848, Easter Sunday fell on the 23rd of April. So I've been studying the 29th of April 1848 edition of the Preston Chronicle. I wanted to see what it could tell me about Easter celebrations and life in general in my home county of Lancashire 175 years ago. So why don't we see what's on the front page? Victorian newspapers were very different to the ones we see today. Forget the big bold headlines and the photographs and the celebrity stories. In the 1840s, the first page of the Preston Chronicle was generally made up of very, very tiny print and an awful lot of adverts. If, for instance, you favour fish for dinner, make your way to number 1 Marketplace, where well-connected fishmonger T. Charnley has a stall. He has secured the rights to extensive fisheries on the River Ribble, owned by such illustrious men as Lawrence Rawsthorne, who's probably the occupant of Penwortham Hall based on the census records, John Abel Smith, who I think may be the MP for Chichester, and a mysterious person called Lord Moss, who I cannot yet identify. Mr. Charnley is also an agent for the Fleetwood Fishing Company, the only agent for the sale of loon salmon, and will supply fresh fish at a low price. In late April, in a time before fridges have been invented, you can appreciate why fresh fish would be extremely important. And there's no means of chilling things the way we do in the modern world. You really do not want to be eating yesterday's catch. Elsewhere, we find an advert headed "Initial Wafers," which is inviting the reader to buy some customised wafers. These are not those pink biscuits that you get. For 6pence, you can have a box of 70 elegant wafers, with your initials stamped in full. That's an interesting challenge if you've got a long name. Sent free by return of post to any part of the kingdom for 7 postage stamps. Immediately, I began thinking of communion wafers, but reading further on, I don't think this kind are the edible ones. If marriage was on your horizon, you were invited perhaps to buy a packet of 50 beautifully illustrated nuptial wafers, expressly for weddings, or 100 in virgin silver or white for 13 postage stamps. The chaste and beautiful manufacture of the nuptial seal wafers has gained them the preference of all others in the most fashionable circles. So these wedding wafers seem to be a bit posh. These are nice wafers. I'm still not convinced that they're edible. They're talking about silver here. Fortunately, I found a link to Charles Tomlinson's 1866 publication, The Cyclopaedia of Useful Arts, Mechanical and Chemical, Manufactures, Mining and Engineering. The Victorians did love an all-encompassing book title. And on page 800 we find the answer. The invention of wafers is attributed to the Genoese, so that's Genoa in Italy, isn't it? But long before their application to the sealing of letters, they were made by the pastry cook. Wafers are small discs of dried wheaten paste to which an adhesive property is instantly communicated on the addition of moisture. So you have to get these wet in order to use them. Reading between the lines, I think wafers must have been an economical, self-adhesive alternative to the slightly grander wax seal. Ideal for those who want to make their correspondence look a bit more sophisticated without necessarily spending a lot of money. I feel as though I've learnt something there. Directly beneath the wafers advert, there's an entirely different type of notice. For the horse owner who wants to get their mare in foal, essentially. That well-bred stallion, Black Diamond, bred by the Earl of Fitzwilliam, had been let to Mr. Sansom of the Old Bull Inn, Blackburn. Black Diamond is a rich black horse, 4 years old, 16 hands high, a little bit taller than me, with plenty of bone and muscle, and took the prize for the best blood horse at the Blackburn show on Wednesday last. He's a prize winner. This is quite a dating profile, isn't it? For £5 and 5 shillings, Black Diamond's services, shall we say, were available to thoroughbred mares, plus 10 shillings for the groom's fee. If, however, your mare was not a thoroughbred, you would only pay £2 and 2 shillings, although the groom would still receive the 10 shilling fee. If you're not yet convinced, we then get a 3-generation summary of Black Diamond's lineage. His grandfather, Touchstone, was bred by the late Marquis of Westminster and is still the property of the present Marquis. So Black Diamond has clearly got quite a pedigree. He's got friends in high places. And over the following week, he toured Accrington, Haslingden, Bury, Bolton, Ribchester, Clitheroe, Worley. He then had a couple of days at home in Blackburn before he moved on to Chorley, Lakeland and Preston. Quite a tour. But before we move on, there's something cryptic at the bottom right hand corner of page 1. Under the heading, Important to Ladies. An advert for Kearsley's original Widow Welch's female pills. I've mentioned something similar before in another video back in November 2021. So what do these female pills do? It's suspicious, I think. They are ideal for removing obstructions and relieving all other inconveniences to which the female frame is liable. Being perfectly innocent, they may be used with safety in all seasons and climates. There is more than meets the eye to these female pills. Have you ever wondered what constituted useful household advice in the 1840s? Wonder no more. The answer is on page 3, and it's under the heading philosophical domestic economy, where we find one or two useful domestic tips. Maybe you'd like to try them. In airing rooms, both the upper and the lower parts of the window should be opened. These must be sash windows, as the bad and heated air from its lightness will pass out at the top, and the fresh, cool air come in at the bottom. That makes sense because they do say that hot air rises to the top of the room. That logic is perfectly sound. It is a false economy to purchase moist sugar, for half a pound of refined sugar gives more sweetness than 1 pound of raw. That's quite a contrast to today, when we're being told to avoid refined and processed sugars on the grounds that the unrefined are slightly less bad for you. Maybe you need that sugar to go in your cup of coffee. Coffee should never be boiled, as boiling extracts and dispels the fine aromatic oil, which gives it flavour and strength. It should be made by pouring boiling water through coffee in a strainer. But would that work a little like a modern coffee percolator? I think perhaps it might. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, I'm sure that you know that Lancashire became inextricably linked to the cotton industry. So I don't think it's all that surprising that the Preston Chronicle spared a few lines for this little boast about one of its native ships. The bark Isabella of this port, with a cargo of cotton and corn, direct from New Orleans, now in Lytham Dock, is expected to arrive at the Victoria Quay on Wednesday next. She would be the largest vessel that has ever brought a cargo up to Preston, and clearly they were very proud of this. Elsewhere on the page, we suddenly find ourselves plunged right back into the treats and festivities of Easter Monday. At Preston's Corn Exchange, a tea party was held for the benefit of the Catholic scholars on Fox Street, Walker Street and St Ignatius's School, which suggests that this was some kind of fundraising event. Maybe attendees bought tickets or made donations and all the proceeds went to the school. Although the occasion was said to be much deficient in numbers, which is probably code for not many people turned up, there was, however, plenty to enjoy. Haslam's band was engaged, and to its dulcet tones, both sexes tripped it merrily in each dance. How charming. A few miles north of Preston, in Woodblumpton, you'll find St Anne's Church, not very far from the Wheatsheaf Inn. And according to this edition of the Preston Chronicle, the Wheatsheaf was already in business 175 years ago. And we know this because on Easter Monday, the members of the Woodblumpton Harmonic Society celebrated their anniversary at the Wheatsheaf, where a very excellent dinner was provided. And the party was humorous and hearty. Richard Threlfall, the wine merchant, supervised, and the evening was enlightened by some capital singing. They're a harmonic society. I would expect nothing less than a bit of singing. We find quite a sad story. An excellent reminder of how very lucky we are to have effective antiseptics in the year 2023. On Tuesday the 25th of April 1848, an inquest was held at the Hare and Hounds pub in Paddingham. 63-year-old Anne Yates had died, and they needed to know why. It seems that Anne was a practical woman, On the previous Monday, while whitewashing an upstairs room in what I presume to have been her own home, Anne climbed a ladder. She must have been trying to get to the top of the walls. Unfortunately, the ladder slipped and Anne fell down onto the floor, cutting her knee, which doesn't sound particularly bothersome. And indeed the injury did seem to be healing until the Thursday following, when mortification, what we would call gangrene or necrosis, suddenly set in. The following Monday, Anne's condition having worsened considerably, she died. So the inquest took all of this into consideration and ultimately ruled that the cause was accidental. A very tragic way to go. And somehow I think it seems quite fitting that page 5 also happens to include the births, marriages and deaths column. Now I would like a births, marriages and deaths column, particularly in an old newspaper. You get all sorts of little stories. On Saturday last, suddenly at Lytham, where he had gone for the benefit of his health, Henry Harrison of Broughton near Manchester, in the 54th year of his age. Poor Henry Harrison, he thought he was going to get better. Not every announcement was to do with a native of Lancashire. On the 24th ult, the 24th ultimate that is, so the 24th of the previous month, at New Prospect, Bengal County, in the United States, at the extraordinary age of 110 years, Mrs. Charity Berry. She was married during the Revolutionary War and was the mother of 13 children, all of whom still survive. She was remarkable for one thing, which may account in a great measure for her prolonged life. She was noted for her opposition to tight lacing. So Charity Berry must have been born in about 1738. She'd have been a young woman in the 1760s. I didn't think they were into tight lacing back then. You learn something new every day. Perhaps you've noticed that up until now, all of the stories I've highlighted, with the sad exception of Anne Yates and the other deaths, have been generally useful, practical, community-minded, occasionally quite worthy. All that changes when we come to page 7, where we find a couple of men behaving really rather badly. On census night, 1851, if we look at the census for Barrowford in East Lancashire, we find an unmarried 34-year-old handloom weaver named Eli Smith lodging with the family of John and Anne Horn on Wheatley Lane. So why am I telling you that? What's Barrowford got to do with Preston? Well, I think he is the same Eli Smith who was named in this edition of the Preston Chronicle. He was said to be from Barrowford, but what was his crime? He'd been stealing gooseberry trees from Henry Howarth. One Saturday night, Mr. Howarth went to bed knowing that 16 gooseberry trees were nicely planted in his garden. He gets up on Sunday, and they've all vanished. So Henry Howarth, perhaps surprisingly to our modern minds, called the police. He enlisted the help of Police Constable Nicholas Horan. And when PC Horan went to the section of shared ground that Eli Smith used as a garden, what does he find? A nice row of gooseberry trees. There was some understandable debate over how Henry Howarth could be sure that those particular trees were his trees. Surely they didn't have his name on. But ultimately, Eli Smith was found guilty and had to pay 2 pence per tree, a 20-shilling penalty for trespass, and all the costs. He must have been up all night digging those trees up. How on earth did nobody notice? You would notice a man carrying a tree, surely. But that story, mad as it is quite tame compared to the shocking story of Thomas Glover. In 1848, the Chorley Petty Sessions were held on Easter Tuesday, when Thomas Glover, labourer of Coppull, was convicted of being a rogue and a vagabond for indecently exposing his person on the highways in Coppull on the 20th of March last, with intent to insult a female. He was sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment with hard labour in the House of Correction. This is not the kind of behaviour that we associate with the Victorian era, but clearly it did go on. Given that Mr. Glover waited until a lady was passing, I think it is absolutely obvious that he was deliberately trying to shock. This is not accidental exposure, it's quite deliberate. And I am sure that the magistrate felt absolutely justified in passing that prison sentence. It was not accidental, he meant to do it, and he ended up in prison for it. But as it's Easter, I think that rather than leave this video there with that surprising story, we should end with something a little more wholesome. Fortunately, this particular edition of the Preston Chronicle offers lots of snippets to choose from. At the time of going to press, did you know that the average number of books added to the library of the British Museum every year was stated to be 30,000. This bookcase behind me, which I know you can only see part of, contains less than 300 books. I'm just trying to imagine how many shelves you would need to be adding 30,000 books a year. Meanwhile, over in Bacup in East Lancashire, on the 26th of April, the town's Institution Hall hosted the quarterly general meeting of the Bacup News Society. They had a membership of about 50 people. And in this meeting, they decided to overturn their previous rule against religious newspapers, and duly added the Nonconformist to their selection, as well as the Northern Star. The Institution Hall in Bacup was quite busy that week. 2 days later, the same venue hosted a temperance tea party, where the evening was enlivened by dialogues and recitations. And popular music was also given by Mr. Greenwood on the piano at intervals. A gentleman playing the piano, that's quite unusual for the Victorian era, surely. For a bit of variety, there were also 2 Chartist demonstrations held, one on Bagslade Moor and one in Union Square, where there was a good sprinkling of police in attendance. I like that phrase, a sprinkling of police. Ultimately they weren't really needed, and both meetings were conducted quite peacefully. Not too much bad behaviour to report there. Easter seems to have been the perfect excuse for various events in all parts of Lancashire. And 2 stories that particularly caught my eye both relate to Chorley, where things range from the sober to the truly spectacular. Had you been near the schoolroom of the Independent Chapel on St George's Street on the evening of Easter Tuesday, I am certain that the members of the Total Abstinence Society would have welcomed you to their public tea party. To hear their visitors from Salford, Stockport, Wigan and Preston give speeches about total abstinence. And I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that they were much applauded. They were clearly speaking to the right audience. Going to the other extreme, at the Fazakerley Arms, where total abstinence probably was not encouraged at all, in the marketplace in Chorley, a display of French, Italian and Chinese fireworks was organised. And where we might talk about our modern rockets and Catherine wheels today, the early Victorians seem to have had far more exotic names for their fireworks. We learn that a grand gallopade of serpents, the bird of paradise, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, etc., could be seen to a considerable distance. I don't know what you think, but I would really love to know what a bird of paradise looked like. I imagine it was spectacular. This video was inspired by a single edition of an 8-page regional newspaper, but maybe that's enough to give us an idea of how people celebrated Easter 175 years ago in the general Lancashire area. I've only mentioned 18 extracts from the entire publication, and of these, 4 were adverts. The Preston Chronicle was not a national title, it was quite a local one. But, as we have seen, its contents were not just confined to the town of Preston. Even international stories made their way in. There were at least 2 from the United States of America, and think how long that must have taken to reach Preston. People were aware of the world beyond the town that they lived in. One thing that I did notice was that there was a total lack of references to what the historic UK website calls the ancient Lancashire custom of pace egging at Easter. Traditionally, this involved wrapping an ordinary chicken's egg in onion skin and then boiling it. The onion skin would apparently lose its colour, transfer it to the eggshell, and it would leave the shell with this sort of motley gold appearance. This is obviously not something that we can replicate with our modern chocolate Easter egg, but maybe the idea of this goldish pace egg explains why we now wrap our modern chocolate Easter eggs in coloured foil. From what I can make out, people didn't just throw away the pace egg after they played with it or rolled it down the hill. They did actually consume them, so nothing went to waste. But legend has it that when you've eaten your pace egg, you must remember to crush the shells afterwards, because if you don't, one of the Lancashire witches will come along and find it, and she might use it as a boat.